morning after coverage of President Trump's primetime address to the nation on April 1, 2026, regarding Operation Epic Fury. The segment included White House correspondent Jackie Heinrich, correspondent Jonathan Hunt reporting from Tel Aviv, and extended discussion among the hosts about NATO, the speech's content, and the war's trajectory. Let's break down what was said, what was confirmed, and what the speech actually revealed.
Prices as short-term and the American economy as able to absorb it. And while he described this conflict as nearly over, there was also an implicit threat of escalation, leaving open the question of whether he could send in ground troops or whether victory can be declared without extracting Iran's stockpiles of enriched uranium.
I can say tonight that we are on track to complete all of America's military objectives shortly, very shortly. We're going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong.
The president said the U.S. is negotiating with a new, more reasonable regime, but rattled off targets if no deal is reached, including Iran's oil and energy plants, which he said would be hit simultaneously. Analysts say it was the kind of speech he should have delivered at the outset to build more support. The Wall Street Journal editorial board writing, media coverage of the war in the U.S. has been so relentlessly negative that Iran's leaders may really believe that they're winning. But Mr. Trump assured them he plans to continue the war to devastating effect if they don't abandon their nuclear and terror ambitions. He made no offer of a ceasefire. Trump also urged countries that depend on oil from the Strait to instead buy from the U.S. and build what he called delayed courage to secure the critical shipping lane. Notably, the president did not directly criticize NATO or announce any U.S. withdrawal from the alliance, which he suggested in an interview yesterday was beyond reconsideration. Finnish President Alexander Stubb, with whom President Trump has a close relationship, posted ahead of the speech, spoke with real Donald Trump POTUS, constructive discussion and exchange of ideas on NATO, Ukraine, and Iran. Problems are there to be resolved pragmatically. It's not clear if that conversation may have staved off some harsh words from the president pointed at NATO guys.
Yeah, and meanwhile, Jackie, Italy says you can't use our air bases. Spain says you can't use our air bases. Macron says militarily we're not going to be victorious. The UK is trying to put something together, but there's really no rally to our side in any way.
Yeah, the UK Prime Minister is leading a virtual summit today of 35 countries to try to build some kind of consensus on military or diplomatic efforts to reopen the Strait, obviously a response to that strong pressure from President Trump. But you heard Secretary Rubio say on Hannity the other night that, you know, if these countries are not going to allow the U.S. to use those bases when it needs to, then NATO is a one-way street, and the troops are only in Europe for the defense of Europe, not for American interests. That's the message here from the White House. So when the Secretary General comes here next week to meet with President Trump, I assume will be talking in great detail about that.
Yeah, I just think there's a big difference between using our bases, which we help construct, and not helping at all in the mission. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.
And I think they should realize, because I'm sure they will say there's a treaty which is approved by the Senate and Congress, but there's only one commander-in-chief, meaning the treaty can exist, but the president is in command of the armed forces. So do they think they're going to be able to command the troops to go into there? Absolutely not.
So what's interesting, too, is that today the UAE is going to the United Nations and asking for condemnation from the Security Council for closing the Strait. So our allies in NATO are not helping us open the Strait. But the Gulf states are saying this is illegal. And actually, this is a time in which the UN sees this outlaw behavior by Iran as a problem.
It's a realignment.
Yeah. Now to Jonathan Hunt, who is live in Tel Aviv as Iran has fired missiles into Tel Aviv as Israel observes Passover. Jonathan.
Brian, good morning to you guys. Israel was fully expecting and was braced for an Iranian barrage of missiles to mark the beginning of the Jewish holiday of Passover, and that is exactly what happened. Iranian missile launchers firing missile after missile in the direction of central, southern and northern Israel overnight and throughout Wednesday. And some of those missiles and the cluster bombs attached to them did make it through, causing damage on the ground and dozens of injuries. Meantime, the U.S. and Israeli bombardment of Iran continues, with flames burning near Isfahan in Iran. That is the site of one of Iran's major nuclear reactors. But despite the bombardment coming at them, Iranian officials are seeming increasingly defiant. No talk of a ceasefire, as President Trump said Iran was looking for. Instead, the Iranian officials are saying they are prepared to continue this war as long as it takes. Listen here.
You know nothing of our vast and strategic capacities. Do not hope that you have destroyed our centers for producing strategic missiles, long-range offensive and precision-guided drones, modern air defense systems, electronic warfare systems, and our specialized equipment. Because of such assumptions, you will only further increase the depth of the swamp in which you have trapped yourselves.
And with Iranian proxy militias across the region getting increasingly involved in this, U.S. citizens are being warned not to travel to this region. The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, for instance, telling all U.S. citizens they should get out of Iraq right now. Brian?
And they've said that before. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Because there's Iranian militias working in Iraq. One of the benefits of a defanged Iran will be the Iraqis having control of their own country because they've infected the whole northern part.
Yeah, they have indeed. And, you know, President Trump, I thought what he said last night was so important. And one part that I think might have been overlooked, but it was important to me, was when he said, they made mistakes and I am correcting them, I believe referring to his predecessors. And if you really think about it, we all agree Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. But what did his predecessors do and what is he having to undo? Obama, in his words, quote, "It is true if Iran lives up to its commitments in the nuclear deal, they will gain access to roughly $56 billion. How did that work out? The $400 million in cash shipped over. It didn't work out. It was a failed nuclear deal. Then you move forward to Biden, $6 billion in unfrozen Iranian assets. And what happened? They unleashed their proxies and October 7th happened. We've tried it that way. It didn't work. And President Trump is correcting the mistakes and trying to ensure the safety, not just of the United States, to your point, of the world.
Well, also, this is not his first time negotiating with Iran. Remember, this is a president that spent 4 years before this in the White House dealing with Iran. And then he had a 4-year break. And so it's not like we're restarting. The president understands what bad actors they are. And he's also urging the world, look, we don't actually need the oil coming from the Middle East, but many of the world does. And they should probably get some independence from them. Here's the president.
We're now totally independent of the Middle East, and yet we are there to help. We don't have to be there. We don't need their oil. We don't need anything they have, but we're there to help our allies. Many Americans have been concerned to see the recent rise in gasoline prices here at home. This short-term increase has been entirely the result of the Iranian regime launching deranged terror attacks against commercial oil tankers in neighboring countries that have nothing to do with the conflict. This is yet more proof that Iran can never be trusted with nuclear weapons. They will use them, and they will use them quickly. It would lead to decades of extortion, economic pain, and instability worse than we can ever imagine. The United States has never been better prepared economically to confront this threat.
So I think it's important to point out, we just showed like a minute of Iran's version of Baghdad Bob just spouting off about how great Iran's doing. We can't find any of their missiles. We have most of the stuff that's hidden. Just understand where they're coming from. The guy has lost 250 commanders, political as well as military. That's just in 2026, let alone the dozens that were killed in their beds by the Israelis and others called to a false meeting. A meeting that didn't exist, and then the Israelis blew them up. If anybody understands what's going on in there, it's Israel. And we just heard of a possible assassination on one of the foreign ministers and his family that took place. Because these guys can talk all they want, but the only reason the speaker is alive, as well as the foreign minister is alive, is because the Pakistanis asked us to ask the Israelis not to kill them because we had their coordinates down.
And the Ayatollah gone, like in day one, in 24 hours. Who's
famously said, death to America is not a slogan, it is a policy.
100% it is.
That was the policy.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.
Sealed. President Trump predicted in a primetime address that the U.S. will complete its military mission in Iran very shortly, and said U.S. forces have achieved overwhelming victories. But he did not offer a definitive timeline as questions swirl about when and how the war could wrap up. The key quotes from the speech are confirmed. Trump said, "We are on track to complete all of America's military objectives shortly, very shortly. We're going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong." Trump threatened that if Iran does not strike a deal, the military will hit each and every one of their electric generating plants very hard and probably simultaneously. He said he could also target Iran's oil industry. Crude oil futures spiked more than 5% after the speech, while stock futures slid, reversing a rally from earlier in the day amid hopes that the war might conclude soon. Markets interpreted the speech not as a peace signal, but as an escalation warning. The most significant revelation was buried in a single line. On the huge question of whether Trump would use U.S. troops to seize Iran's enriched uranium, the president indicated it was no longer a priority, saying, "It would take months to get near the nuclear dust, and we have that under intense satellite surveillance and control. If we see them make a move, even a move, we will hit them very hard with missiles again. This is a major shift." For weeks, the administration discussed special forces raids to seize Iran's uranium as central to the mission. Secretary Rubio said, "People are going to have to go and get it." Now the president is saying surveillance is sufficient. The Irish Times noted that the address dismissed the idea of U.S. troops going after the nuclear materials that the Iranians might one day use to produce nuclear capabilities, and offered no hint of what a future Iran leadership might look like. The Fox News segment did not explore this shift. It should have. If the uranium is not being seized, the claim that Iran will not have nuclear weapons rests entirely on satellite monitoring and the threat of future strikes, a deterrence posture, not the permanent elimination of nuclear capability that was originally promised. The Fox News segment correctly noted one significant omission. Trump did not criticize NATO or announce a U.S. withdrawal from the alliance, which he had suggested yesterday was beyond reconsideration. The transcript mentions that Finnish President Alexander Stubb spoke with Trump and described it as a constructive discussion, suggesting diplomatic intervention may have walked the president back from the ledge. However, the segment's relief about the NATO omission shouldn't obscure the damage already done. The president spent 48 hours publicly threatening to dismantle the Western world's most important security alliance. That those threats were not repeated in one speech does not undo them. Jockey Heinrich's observation that this was the kind of speech he should have given at the outset is a legitimate critique. The war has been fought for 32 days without a formal primetime explanation to the American people. That gap allowed confusion, misinformation, and market panic to fill the vacuum. Jonathan Hunt's reporting from Tel Aviv that Iran launched missiles on Passover as expected, causing dozens of injuries, with cluster bombs making it through defenses, is confirmed by multiple sources. The hosts' extended discussion about the Obama-Iran deal and Biden's unfreezing of Iranian assets, while historically relevant, functioned as a deflection from the present. The question is not whether previous administrations handled Iran perfectly. They did not. The question is whether the current approach is achieving its stated goals at an acceptable cost. Brian Kilmeade's casual discussion of Israeli assassination operations, the Israelis blew them up, we have their coordinates, treated the targeted killing of foreign officials and their families as entertainment content rather than serious ethical and legal questions with consequences for international law and diplomatic norms. NPR reported that a U.S. official told them the U.S. has only been able to confirm the elimination of around 1/3 of Iran's missile capabilities, 1/3, after 12,000 combat missions and 32 days of bombing. If only 1/3 of the missile capability has been confirmed destroyed, the claim that objectives are nearing completion requires significant qualification that the segment did not provide. A CBS News poll shows most Americans aren't sold on the war, with 60% disapproving of the U.S. taking military action in Iran and 67% saying they are unwilling to pay more for gas during the conflict, though an overwhelming majority of Republicans support the war. This domestic opposition was not mentioned once in the Fox News segment. More than 4,800 people have been killed in the conflict, most of them in Iran, with more than 3,400 deaths according to the human rights activists' news agency. More than 1,200 people have been killed in Lebanon. 13 U.S. service members have been killed. 19 Israeli civilians have been killed. Gas is now $4.06 a gallon. Oil spiked above $104 a barrel after the speech. An American journalist is being held hostage in Iraq. 20,000 seafarers remain stranded near the Strait of Hormuz. And the President of the United States just told the world he will bomb Iran's power plants and potentially its water desalination facilities if a deal isn't reached in 2 to 3 weeks. This was the morning after the most important presidential address of this conflict, and the Fox News coverage revealed a familiar split. Solid field reporting from Jonathan Hunt and Jackie Heinrich, surrounded by host commentary that oscillated between legitimate observation and partisan cheerleading. The Associated Press described the speech as Trump urging an increasingly skeptical electorate to give him a bit more time. That framing is more honest than anything said in this Fox News segment. The president simultaneously declared victory and promised to escalate. He said the war is nearing completion and then promised to hit Iran extremely hard for another 2 to 3 weeks. He said Iran's military has been decimated and then threatened to destroy their power grid and water supply if they don't make a deal. He said the nuclear threat has been neutralized and then admitted it would take months to get near the nuclear dust. These are not complimentary statements, they are contradictions, and no one in this segment identified them as such. The president told a global audience that the United States intends to bomb a country of 88 million people back to the Stone Age. He threatened to simultaneously destroy each and every one of Iran's electric generating plants. He mentioned potentially targeting desalination plants, infrastructure that provides drinking water. These are not military targets. These are the systems that keep a civilian population alive. Destroying them would constitute collective punishment on a scale that international humanitarian law categorically prohibits. The Irish Times noted the speech offered no hint of what a future Iran leadership might look like, and no solace for U.S. allies in the Gulf beyond a general thank you. What it did offer was a promise to make life unlivable for tens of millions of Iranian civilians if their government, over which they have no democratic control, does not capitulate within weeks. The segment did not challenge this threat. Not one host or analyst asked, what happens to 88 million people when the power goes out? What happens to the hospitals, the water treatment plants, the refrigeration of food and medicine? What happens to the children, the elderly, the sick? For weeks, the administration positioned the seizure of Iran's enriched uranium as perhaps the single most critical objective of this war. Special forces were deployed. Plans were drawn up. Expert after expert appeared on television discussing the logistics of a nuclear extraction mission. Now, in a single sentence buried in a 19-minute speech, the president has effectively abandoned that objective, replacing physical seizure with satellite monitoring and the threat of future missile strikes. Trump told Reuters separately that he doesn't care about the highly enriched uranium Iran has stored underground. If this is true, it fundamentally changes the nature of what this war accomplished. The uranium remains in Iran. It remains enrichable to weapons grade. The only thing preventing its use is surveillance and the implicit threat of future American military action, which is functionally the same deterrence posture that existed before the war began, minus the IAEA inspectors who once had access and now do not. This is not victory on the nuclear question. It is a rebranding of the status quo, achieved at the cost of thousands of lives, a global energy crisis, and the potential collapse of NATO. Kayleigh McEnany's recitation of the Obama and Biden administration's Iran policies was historically accurate in its broad strokes. The JCPOA was imperfect. The $6 billion asset release was controversial. But this segment used those facts not as context, but as a shield. arguing that because previous approaches failed, the current approach is therefore justified. That is not analysis. That is a logical fallacy. The failure of diplomacy does not automatically validate the success of a 32-day bombing campaign that has left the uranium in place, the strait closed, and nearly 5,000 people dead. Lawrence Jones's argument that the commander-in-chief is in charge of the armed forces and can override Congress on NATO is constitutionally dangerous. Congress did, in fact, pass a law requiring Senate approval for NATO withdrawal. The suggestion that the president can simply ignore this because he is in charge undermines the checks and balances that define American governance. Brian Kilmeade's point about Gulf states supporting the U.S. at the United Nations while NATO allies do not is a valid observation, but it requires context. Gulf states were lobbied by Saudi Arabia and Israel to support this war before it began. They are also bearing the physical consequences. Iranian missiles have struck Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and Bahrain. Their support is not altruistic. It is existential. The president told the nation the war is almost over. He also told the nation the bombing will intensify. He told the nation Iran will never have nuclear weapons. He also told the nation the uranium will stay where it is. He told the nation gas prices will come down. He also promised actions, destroying power plants, targeting oil infrastructure that would almost certainly push oil prices higher. Trump has offered shifting reasons for launching the war, but he has been consistent in articulating that a primary objective is ensuring Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. But over the course of the conflict, he has been more circumspect about how far he's willing to go to follow through on that pledge. The American public is being asked to accept that 32 days of war, nearly 5,000 dead, $4 gas, a fractured NATO alliance, and an ongoing Strait of Hormuz crisis have achieved something that could not have been achieved any other way. That is the claim. Whether it is true and whether the costs were justified is the question that history will answer and that the press has a duty to ask every day until this war is over. Because if the uranium stays underground, the strait stays closed, the gas stays high, the allies stay angry, and the dead stay dead, then what exactly was this for? That is the question. And 19 minutes from the White House did not answer it.